It seemed that since we were now in a quiet position, every officer in the division with the rank of major or above wanted to inspect the company area. They condemned the men for not having shaved or for wearing knit wool caps without their helmets, evidently an unpardonable misdemeanour, or for untidy areas around the dugouts. The officers did not inspect my first platoon area, however, usually passing it over with the excuse that it was a bit far to walk, but we laughed inwardly, knowing that it was the threat of enemy shelling that kept most of them away. I finally protested the inspections to Captain Anderson, and a captain from the regiment was sent up a few days later with the primary mission of inspecting my first platoon area. That was the virtual end of the inspections, however, either from my protest or the fact that all the inspection-minded brass had satisfied their egos with visits to the front. We wondered how many Silver Stars and Distinguished Service Crosses came from the visits. The days were not monotonous. I visited each platoon at least every other day, and either adjusted artillery and mortar fire or assisted the headquarters men in improving the CP at other times. The men were busy improving their dugouts or foxholes, and at night held long sessions of poker or general discussions by the light of kerosene lanterns purchased in Vielsalm. Church services were held at battalion on Sundays, and many men walked the distance through rain, mud, sleet and snow to attend the services. A quota for showers at regiment was allowed each day, and men continued to go to the division rest area. 3 men were included in the regiment's quota for passes to Paris. When they returned, they were a never-ending source of information on the conduct of the remarkable femmes in the gay city. Each returning soldier had virtually the same remark. "Damned good-looking girls come right up to you on the street and say, 'You zig-zig me, baby.' Of course they want to be paid, but what the hell? They'll stay with you all night for 1,000 francs. Coucher avec became a part of our colourful, if not so grammatically correct vocabularies. Only a few men were wounded. The first platoon medic was hit by shrapnel minutes after I had paid a visit to the platoon area. Sergeant Sickmiller, one of the first platoon squad leaders, wandered into one of the squad's hand grenade booby traps in the darkness and caught a fragment in his leg. Staff Sergeant Raymond Meade contracted pneumonia, and his temperature rose alarmingly high during the night before we could evacuate him. Replacements and hospital returnees continued to arrive until the company was over strength. They included First Sergeant Steve Newbert of San Antonio, Texas, a former company first sergeant who had been wounded in Normandy, Technical Sergeant Bernard Sealand of St. Paul Min, a former platoon sergeant of the 2D platoon, Private First Class Jacob R. Charles of Washington, PA, and Private First Class Clovis P. Robinson of Lexington, CI, both former SCR 300 operators with the company, and First Lieutenant Delos Wilson, formerly an officer with an anti-aircraft unit, who had only recently been reassigned to the infantry. I assigned him as 3D platoon leader. Private First Class Charles Perdue of Little Rock, ARC, formerly the company commander's personal runner, rejoined company headquarters, and Private First Class Joseph Wright of Denver, Colo, a replacement, was assigned to headquarters as a radio repairman. Salberg, the headquarters bazooka man, had become my runner after Croteau was evacuated. The officers received a monthly whiskey ration consisting of 1 quart of scotch, 1 pint of gin, 1 or 2 bottles of cognac, a bottle of champagne, and a bottle of Cointreau. The officers paid for the rations, but for the most part they were far from personal items. The bottles were passed among all the men of the platoons until they were exhausted, which was accomplished rather rapidly. We wondered at letters to the editor in the Stars and Stripes complaining about officers getting whiskey rations when enlisted men did not. On November 10th, Middlebrook was called to division headquarters, where he was commissioned a second lieutenant. He was reassigned to the company, and I held him temporarily in company headquarters as an excess officer. Enemy patrol action was confined to noises to the front of the 1st platoon and 1 4-man reconnaissance patrol, which worked its way close to the left flank of the 2D platoon at 11 o'clock one night before we opened fire with mortars. Occasionally we fired the 60 mm mortars at curious blue and red lights that appeared several times along the highway to our front. we decided that the Germans were signalling with a small flashlight equipped with blue and red shields. One lone German surrendered to the M Company machine gunners attached to the 1st Platoon, claiming that he had been accused of stealing an overcoat from a fellow soldier and that he would rather face the American PW cages than a German court-martial. On Tuesday, November 21st, a reconnaissance detail from Company F arrived to relieve us for 7 days, while we reverted to regimental reserve for a rest and reorganisation period. We did not like the idea of moving. Except for the shelling of the 1st Platoon area and the patrolling called for by higher headquarters, there was little to cause us to desire the move. We were relieved shortly after noon the next day, and the men hiked to the rear by platoons, assembling at battalion where they loaded on trucks and moved 10 miles to the northwest, to Lommersweiler, Belgium, located on the banks of a tributary of the Our River, which separated Belgium from Germany, and 4 miles from St. Vith, Belgium. I remained with Sergeant Albin for the orientation of the incoming company commander, Captain George H. Duckworth of Shelburne, IND, and his first sergeant. We arrived by jeep in Lommersweiler at dusk, half frozen from a driving cold wind and rain. The town was a typical small farming town. We shared its occupancy with Company L and apathetic German-speaking civilians and smelly manure piles. The men had several rooms in each house equipped with bunks similar to the bunks in our log dugouts. The town was equipped with electric lights, which worked at various times during the day, but went off with amazing alacrity with the approach of darkness. The company mess hall was a converted community entertainment hall, a small wooden building with a rostrum at one end. Movies were shown twice nightly in the hall, once for Company L and once for Company 1. Arrangements were made for the division orchestra to play for our noon meal the next day, Thanksgiving. I entered the mess hall as usual for the noon meal and took my customary place in the chow line, but Sergeant Newbert met me and insisted that I go up to the front table. I went forward reluctantly. The cooks had already prepared a plate for me. It was sitting on the table, weighted down with turkey and dressing. I began to eat, and the mess hall was practically full when the orchestra stopped playing and swung into Happy Birthday. It was only then that I remembered this was something special. This was my birthday. Sergeant Newbert came out on the rostrum bearing a large cake decorated with 22 candles of assorted sizes. The men took up the Happy Birthday song with lusty voices. I could not repress a choking sensation in my throat, and it was all I could do to keep back the tears of gratitude. The cake was crude, for the materials had been limited and the army provides no candles, but there was no denying the looks on the men's faces and the lusty singing of the song. My fears were happily over. These veterans of Company Y had accepted their replacement company commander. The 7 days began to roll by swiftly. A Red Cross donut wagon visited the town on Friday. On Saturday, we travelled by truck to a town across the river where we practised for a battalion parade in the morning, had lunch brought to us by the company kitchen, and paraded in the afternoon. None of us favoured the parade, and the rain that fell intermittently all day added not at all to our pleasure. It was hard to appreciate the regiment's desire to claim that ours was the first formal parade on German soil since the occupation troops left after World War I. On Sunday, there were Protestant church services in the mess hall with Chaplain Isaac M. Anderson of Chicago officiating. Catholic services were held at regiment and transportation was provided. We relieved Company F beginning at 6:30 on the morning of November 30th. Despite our reluctance at leaving our former area, we were now reluctant to return. The relief was accomplished without incident, however, and we settled down once again to a routine existence in the defensive position. We received post-exchange rations of candy, cigars, and 1 cigarette lighter for a company of 200 men. First Lieutenant Robert J. Roftis of Toledo, Ohio, a battalion medical officer, came to my CP to administer typhus shots to the entire company. There were more calls from battalion to send out patrols and more sleepless hours awaiting their return. Mortar and artillery fire fell sporadically on the 1st Platoon. The weather alternated between rain, sleet and snow, with only an occasional glimpse of the sun. I was pinned to the ground for 15 minutes by enemy machine gun fire while visiting the right squad of the 1st Platoon. An enemy tank and armoured car were sighted far to our front, driving to the door of a pillbox and then churning again to the rear. 4 lucky men were named for 90-day rotation furloughs to the US, the outfit's first experience with anything to compare even slightly with the Air Corps' rotation system. Most men who took the time to figure, however, found that unless drastic changes in the system took place, it would be at least 1999 before they would see the States again, barring serious wounds, the only salvation. Rumours spread like wildfire that our division was pulling out of the defensive positions to go into the attack. A reconnaissance party from a company of a division that had debarked at Le Havre, France, only 3 days before, arrived on December 10th to give meat to the rumours. They were overjoyed at the prospect of seeing their first combat in such ideal defensive positions, and they showed little fear of the thinly spread lines. I was called to battalion headquarters to get the information on the relief. Our division was pulling out to move to the vicinity of Elsenborn, Belgium, farther north on the German border, to launch an attack against the vital dams of the upper Roer River. We had to remove our division shoulder patches. It was to be a highly secret offensive operation. It had begun to snow when our relief appeared the next afternoon. My men were amazed at the appearance of the men from the incoming unit. They were equipped with the maze of equipment that only replacements fresh from the States would have dared to call their own. And horror of horrors, they were wearing neckties, shades of General Patton. The date was 5 days before December 16th, 1944. The location was near Saint-Vith, Belgium, on the southern half of the First Army Front. The relieving unit was the 106th Infantry Division. We finally reached our destination, a giant fir forest 3 miles west of Elsenborn, at 9 o'clock, half frozen from a 5-hour nightmare of cold, snow, and hazardous blackout driving. The men half jumped and half fell from the open 2.5-ton trucks to the ice-covered road, cursing the misfortune that had subjected them to such an ordeal. We had ploughed along the snow-covered roads at breakneck speeds, the drivers endeavouring to keep the tail light of the preceding vehicle in view, only to experience a period of freezing waiting while the convoy was held up by an obstruction ahead about which we knew nothing. The snow had grown steadily deeper as we went farther north, until now there was a foot of frozen whiteness covering the ground. We hiked for a mile along the icy highway through the forest, slipping and sliding in the darkness, until we met our guide, Staff Sergeant Howard Wolfgang of Taylor Parr, who had preceded us on the battalion billeting detail. We crossed a bridge over a small icy stream and turned right on a one-way trail leading up a hill into the dense forest, the reflection from the snow alleviating somewhat the darkness of the night. 100 yards up the trail, Sergeant Wolfgang stopped and pointed to the thick, snow-covered forest on either side of the narrow trail. "This is it, Captain," he said. I felt like crying. My feet and my body were half frozen, and the prospect of spending the remainder of the night in the frozen forest made me miserable. I directed the platoons into areas on either side of the trail, and they began to search the woods for some semblance of shelter. The forest, deathly silent a moment before, was soon filled with the trampling of many men, punctuated by sharp curse words and the sound of shovels scraping against the frozen earth. Blackburn said that the CP group had found several old slit trenches covered with logs. I joined him, and the platoons reported one by one that they were getting set up in old foxholes and slit trenches that would be satisfactory for the night and could be improved the next day. Our kitchen truck arrived and parked on the one-way trail, only to be routed out with the arrival of other trucks that needed to move farther up the trail. Gradually, the battalion settled down for the night. I shared a hole with Savage and Blackburn. Logs had been placed over the top, giving a 4-foot clearance underneath. We scraped off the snow from the sieve-like roof and placed a canvas shelter half over it, but drops of icy water from the remnants of melting snow dripped upon us the remainder of the night. The next morning, we had eaten a breakfast of hot cakes and syrup prepared by a kitchen crew that had found no time for sleep when I was called to battalion. We were to go to regimental headquarters for a meeting of company commanders. Colonel J.B. Lovelace, the regimental CO, greeted us with startling news. Our division, the 2nd, had moved out at 7 o'clock for an attack against the Siegfried Line stronghold of Wallerscheid in the Monschau forest. The division's ultimate objective was to gain control of the dams on the upper Ruhr River, or force the enemy to blow them, eliminating the threat of floodwaters wrecking river crossings planned farther north. Our regiment was in division reserve. Another division had almost reached the dams via a different route, only to be routed and suffer heavy losses from German counterattacks. We followed the description of the offensive avidly. In 1 day, or 2, or perhaps 3, before the fight would be completed, we would probably be engaged in the action. Each day we searched eagerly for news about the progress of the attacking units. Were they meeting much resistance? Were casualties heavy? My personal fear of being committed to the attack grew day by day. I had seen action, but only defensive action along a sector listed as quiet. I had yet to experience the death of one of my men, and knew that casualties would be much higher in the attack. Would I be as paralyzingly afraid on the offense, or more so? There would be no pillboxes or foxholes for shelter when the enemy fire began. Would I personally come out alive? Reports of fierce fighting filtered back to us, and we lived on borrowed time. Some men went for showers at Camp Elsenborn, a former Belgian army garrison occupied by rear elements of the division. Robot bombs buzzed steadily overhead, increasing each day until, by Saturday, December 16th, they roared across every few minutes. We could hear the deep rumble of far-off artillery even better at night than during the day, and the portentous rumble increased in intensity each night like deep drums setting the scene for the main act. Colonel Tuttle returned from the regiment at noon on Saturday. I had seen the colonel return, and I knew even before I picked up the telephone that the call was the one we had been dreading. It was Captain Morris B. Montgomery of River Forest Ill, who had become battalion operations officer when Captain Anderson was transferred to the regiment. "Have your exec get your company ready to move on a moment's notice. You report to battalion right away." The expressions on the faces of the headquarters men around me mirrored my thoughts. They silently began to gather their equipment. I tried to act upbeat as I walked across the trail to battalion. Perhaps this wasn't the call we had been expecting. It could be only an administrative move. But I knew within me that it wasn't. We were headed for trouble. There was a serious expression on the colonel's face as he pointed to his map. "There has been a Kraut penetration in the 99th Division's sector near Rocherath," he said. "We are to move as soon as possible to a forward assembly area in the woods near this road junction, about a mile beyond Rocherath. That's about all the information I can give you, except that we're not going to participate in our division's attack. I don't know whether we attack or defend. Montgomery and I are leaving now to contact the regimental commander from the 99th. There would be no time to send a billeting detail. We would take blanket rolls, 3 meals of K rations and packs, but the bulk of our heavy equipment would be transported later by our kitchen trucks, including my typewriter and an article I had written entitled 9 Days in a Pillbox. There was no need to issue more than a basic load of ammunition. We would be in a forward assembly area initially, whether we attacked or defended. The company was almost ready to leave when I returned. The headquarters men had gathered up my equipment. The trucks were lined up on the main road through the forest, and we climbed aboard. I Company would lead, preceded by Major Vern L. Joseph of Fond du Lac Wyss, the battalion executive officer, in a jeep. I climbed into the cab of the lead truck. Our route took us southeast through the town of Elsenborn, past a large dam and a lake, beneath the ruins of a demolished railroad underpass, and up a hill into the town of Butgenbach and down the hill again into Bullingen. Everywhere there were code signs pointing to rear area installations: Victor, Index rear, Ivanhoe forward. Our trucks turned north toward the twin farming towns of Krinkelt and Rocherath, so close together atop a hill that we did not know when we left one and entered the other. An ambulance met us with its siren screaming and its red signal light flashing on and off. The skies were overcast with the approach of dusk, and we could hear the heavy rumble of artillery in the distance. Fresh shell marks with dirt sprayed in ugly little patches on the snow told us that Krinkelt and Rocherath had undergone intense shellings, and recently. The GIs we passed did not give us the usual happy smiles and shouted well wishes and insults to which we had become accustomed in rear areas. The rumble of the artillery lent a deep undertone to a dread and fear that communicated itself to us as we travelled. "They shelled the hell out of us when we brought some other troops in here today," my driver said. To make conversation, I asked, "How far are we from the front?" "I don't know," he answered, pointing to a long, thick fir forest to the east. "It's over that-a-way." We turned right toward the east at a crossroads 600 yards beyond Rocherath. 2 dirty stone farmhouses guarded the crossroads. I knew that straight ahead led to Wahlerscheid and the attack the other regiments of the division were making. Our route was taking us directly toward the long line of woods which had been on our right. Buzz bombs roared overhead, and unseen anti-aircraft guns and .50 caliber machine guns blazed fiery arcs of steel through the overcast, dusk-heavy skies in their wake. We had not been accustomed to firing at buzz bombs in the area we had left, and the din of the guns provided a tingling thrill like the opening kick-off at a football game. The long convoy of trucks pulled to a halt on the highway at a road junction on the edge of the fir forest. I could see the highway extending to the left through the woods toward the east, where my map showed it entered the Siegfried Line at a point 1.5 miles distant. The road to the right ran south along the edge of the woods back toward Bullingen. The snow around the road junction had been churned into a yellowish mixture of snow and dirt from recent heavy shellings. I tried to ignore the tenseness that came over me, as I thought that at any minute a hail of screaming shells might descend upon us. I jumped from the cab of the truck the moment the convoy pulled to a halt and motioned for the men to dismount. They lined up quickly in single columns along either side of the road, and I signalled, "Forward." Captain Montgomery was standing with Colonel Tuttle a few feet beyond the junction. I began asking directions as we approached to avoid halting the column. I definitely did not like the appearance of the ugly shell marks in the snow. "Take your company down the road to the left," Captain Montgomery said, catching step with me and pointing to his map. "You'll find a slight bend in the road about 600 yards down. Beyond that is a draw running perpendicular to the highway. Place 1 platoon astride the road as a roadblock. Swing your other 2 platoons to the right rear to defend parallel with the highway. You'll tie in with K Company's left flank at a fire break." "What's up, Monty?" I asked. "We attack?" "There's a battalion from the 99th somewhere between us and the Kraut," he said. "But they've had the hell knocked out of them, and nobody knows exactly where they are. The old man's got orders to attack right away, tonight, to re-establish their positions, but I think he's going to stall some way until morning." I tried to deny the portent of his words and looked at him incredulously. We had only a basic load of ammunition. It was practically dark already. We knew virtually nothing about our present location, our objective, or the enemy situation. Even if we did not attack until dawn, our knowledge would be almost as limited then as now. "Which way's the enemy?" I asked, half making light of the assignment. "I don't know. Nobody seems to know a goddamn thing. They say it's that way." And he motioned with one arm to the east. He dropped out of the column, and we continued down the road. The sight of the fresh shell marks in the snow around the road junction continued to haunt me. Shelling in the tall fir woods would be even more disastrous than in the open. Tree bursts would triple the casualty effect of the bursting shells. The sound of small arms fire came from somewhere far down the road. In the gathering darkness, I saw a soldier run toward us from the woods on the right. I could make out an army truck parked beneath the trees behind him, and other soldiers gathered in a group about the truck. "Hey!" the soldier called, motioning to us. "Don't go down there! That's where the fighting's going on!" His words astonished me. I wondered why he thought we had come this far if we did not know there was fighting going on. I accepted it as one of war's crazy incidents. "I know it, buddy," I said. "That's why we're going. But thanks." I looked at Savage. He raised his eyebrows and shrugged his shoulders. The slow, mournful scream of Nebelwerfer shells pierced the air. The men began to scatter to the sides of the road. I signalled for the company to follow, and we plunged into the woods to the left of the road, our packs and equipment rattling loosely as we ran. It was only a moment before the big shells began to explode to our rear. "My God!" I thought. "They've hit the road junction!" Some of the men dropped instinctively to the snow-covered ground. Someone said to stand up beside a tree. There would be more protection against the tree bursts standing than in a prone position. A moment of silence followed the explosions, and I wondered how much damage the shelling had done. I was deeply thankful that I had succeeded in getting my company away from the road junction, and now I wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and the target area. I motioned the company forward and continued through the woods, tracing a course along the bottom of a shallow draw, deep with snow, that ran parallel to the left of the highway. When I saw the bend in the highway, I signalled the company to halt and told Long to follow me with the first platoon. I broke into a half-run, anxious to get the company set up before it became completely dark. Beyond the bend in the road, I could tell by the slope of the ground that the draw was several hundred yards farther. The area we had traversed from the point designated for my right flank was already too large for one company to adequately defend in wooded terrain. So I told Long to establish his roadblock at the bend in the highway. Another barrage of Nebelwerfer fire screamed toward the road junction. A robot bomb roared overhead, erupting another blaze of anti-aircraft fire from guns to our rear. I moved back to the company and led the 2D platoon across the highway, instructing Lieutenant Brock to tie in his defence with Long's right flank, extending as far as possible to the right. I then directed Lieutenant Wilson and the 3D platoon into position beyond the highway on Brock's right. Our frontage was too wide to hold out a support platoon. I looked around for a group of abandoned foxholes to use for a command post, but found none. I chose a spot a few yards beyond the bottom of the draw where the trees were not so dense. A platoon of heavy machine guns arrived from Company M. I directed one section into position on the highway with Long's platoon and the other with the 3D. I told Scotty to place his light guns in the draw on the first platoon's left flank, as they would need a concentration of fire there since the entire left flank would be undefended. There was only one spot from which the 60mm mortars could possibly get overhead clearance to fire, so the mortar section began to set up along the near side of the highway. The Nebelwerfer barrage against the road junction was over, and I heard the other companies moving down the highway. Enemy artillery shells whistled so close overhead that the tall fir trees swayed gently from the breeze. We ducked involuntarily, but the big shells were intended for targets well to our rear. An answering barrage from the 99th Division artillery whistled over us, headed in the opposite direction. There always seemed to be a curtain of heavy shells racing above us. My CP, command post group, dropped their equipment and began to scrape off the top of the snow with small GI entrenching shovels. A soldier came over to me in the darkness. "I'm Lieutenant Jackson," he said. "I'm to be your observer from the 99th Artillery." He indicated two men who were with him, and I made out one man with the box-type radio used by forward observers. I told them to join my headquarters. They knew as much about what we were going to do as I did. I told Savage to begin laying telephone wire to the platoons. I did not believe that Colonel Tuttle would attack until dawn, and we would need communications during the night. I made another round of the platoons. The lieutenants shared my hope that the orders would be changed and we would defend, although they were more than dissatisfied with the present positions. There was no field of fire for the weapons in the thick forest, and a completely undefended flank and rear in dense woods were certainly not desirable. We tried to tell ourselves that the German action to our front could be only a local German attack. The battalion ahead of us was evidently inexperienced and was holding a lengthy line similar to the one we had recently left with the 106th Division. We would have little trouble. I moved back to the CP location where the men were engaged in futile efforts to dig slit trenches in the frozen earth with the little entrenching shovels. Zelin and Naranjo, the battalion runners, had arrived. The colonel wanted to see me. I should bring my map. We found battalion headquarters in a group of old foxholes immediately beyond the firebreak, which separated us from K Company. A dense growth of young firs touched the ground with their branches. Faint streaks of light came from the interior of the colonel's foxhole. He was inside giving the order to one of the other company commanders. I waited my turn and crawled into the wet hole. There was room inside for one man to sit half comfortably. Both Colonel Tuttle and Captain Montgomery were crouched inside, and my presence made it almost impossible to breathe. Someone threw a shelter half over the entrance after me. The colonel began to give me the details of the situation. A battalion from the 393D Regiment of the 99th Division, defending a high ridge to the east and facing the Siegfried Line, had been attacked early that morning by superior enemy forces who took advantage of the battalion's open flanks to knock them off position. That battalion, or remnants of it, continued to fight somewhere between us and the enemy, partially surrounded and all communications gone, except through the artillery liaison officer. Our battalion had been attached to the 393D, as they had no reserve force. Our mission was to counterattack to re-establish the original positions. The colonel continued, "Get set. It's coming now, the attack order. At last you're going to attack. There's no chance now for a reprieve." The CO of the 393D had insisted that we attack immediately to relieve the besieged unit, but he had succeeded in putting off the attack until morning. We would jump off slightly before dawn at 7 o'clock, attacking astride the east-west highway. Company I would attack on the left. Additional ammunition would be available later at battalion. The platoon leaders were assembled when I returned to the company. I had only one map of the area, and there was no place where we could have a light to examine the map with the lieutenants. Sergeant Olbin's slit trench was deeper than the others, but it amounted to little more than the snow scraped from the ground and a few inches of frozen earth removed. The men hastily threw dead branches across the makeshift hole, and I wriggled underneath with my map and a book of matches. One by one, the platoon leaders crawled in to receive the order. I would strike a match and give them a brief glance at the map, now wet and sodden from the melting snow. I wondered if I could have drawn any worse conditions under which to issue my first attack order. The last of the platoon leaders was underneath the rubble with me receiving the order when a call came over the 300 radio from battalion. It was Colonel Tuttle. He said, "Mac, this is Paul. There's been a change in the orders I just gave you. Tell your platoons to dig in where they are. You report back to me. We'll hold where we are." The men around me, through some sixth sense, knew that the attack was off. I thought they were going to do an impromptu dance in and out of the trees. I returned to battalion. The colonel said the regiment had finally decided that the German attack was on too large a scale for one battalion to counterattack successfully. Our mission now was to hold at all costs in our present positions. A limited number of large shovels, picks, and axes were available. We had been able to get a limited amount of ammunition, but thus far there were no bazooka rockets or anti-tank mines. 2 US Sherman medium tanks would be sent to my left flank to cover the highway leading into the area, arriving around 7 o'clock the next morning. "You should know," Colonel Tuttle concluded, "that your supply sergeant was wounded slightly in the Nebelwerfer barrage. Altogether there were 7 killed and 20 wounded." The night wore on. Enemy and friendly artillery continued to whistle overhead, the big guns pounding in a continuous sonoric chant. Buzz bombs roared overhead on constant schedules, setting off a blaze of fireworks from the anti-aircraft guns in our rear. Small arms fire punctuated the night noises far to our front. Around 2 o'clock, a German burp gun erupted several hundred yards to our right. An American machine gun gave a slow, studied answer, like a Model T Ford in contrast to the burp of the enemy gun. Rifles fired. An enemy reconnaissance patrol had hit L Company. Lieutenant Jackson set up his artillery radio, and the voices from its speaker broke above the sound of scraping shovels in the CP area. Fire direction talked back and forth with the artillery liaison officer in the lost battalion of the 393D to our front. There were calls for fire and a relation of the battalion's seemingly hopeless plight. Their casualties were overwhelming. The regimental commander relayed a message for them to hold out as long as possible, but there would be no relief. I kept only one shovel with the CP group, and by continual digging, alternating with the large shovel, we were able to construct a semblance of slit trenches in the frozen earth. Savage, Blackburn and I dug together. It was 2 o'clock before we had a hole which would completely hide our bodies below the surface of the snow when we lay on either side. Most of the men had 1 or 2 blankets, or a GI sleeping bag. Neither Savage nor Blackburn had blankets. They had left them on the kitchen truck, expecting the truck to reach us in the assembly area. We spread my sleeping bag over the inch of cold mud that accumulated in the bottom of our hole and took turns hunching inside the hole to catch a few minutes of sleep. It was not large enough for the 3 of us. We lit cigarettes underneath shelter halves and cupped them carefully in the palms of our hands, lest the light show to some enemy patrol. When I lay down to sleep, my overcoat clutched tightly around me and my head resting inside my helmet, I would drift off for a few minutes, only to awaken sharply with the realization that I was shaking violently from the cold. I would get up, walk in a small circle, stamp my feet, and return to try once again to sleep. As dawn approached, I heard the clatter of the tanks on the highway. I called Long on the sound-powered telephone and told him to intercept them and show them his positions. They had been directed to take defilade positions on our left flank to protect the highway against enemy tanks. The highway was the only possible tank approach into the area. I ate a K-ration as soon as it was light enough to make a fire from its cardboard container, and we tried to improve our slit trenches by putting dead logs across them to protect against shell bursts in the trees above us. The artillery's radio kept up its sonorous chant of messages from fire direction to the liaison officer in the lost battalion. The big guns barked to the rear of us. Buzz bombs roared overhead. Enemy shells whistled close above the tops of the fir trees and crashed into the open fields and the towns behind us. Stray bullets from the small arms fight up ahead began to zing through the woods around 10 o'clock. That was enough to tell us that the attacking Germans were not far away. Lieutenant Jackson called me to his radio. An important message was going through to the lost battalion. "Do you think you can fight your way out?" the sender asked. "I don't know," the liaison officer answered. His voice sounded tense and tired. "We're completely surrounded, but we'll try. We'll try to fight our way out." There was a minute of silence. Then came a series of overs and Rogers, and the liaison officer spoke again. "We're leaving our aid station to care for the wounded. We're coming out." A fury of small arms fire sounded to the front. Stray bullets whined through the trees around us. I called the platoon leaders and told them the message we had overheard, then notified battalion. I told the platoon leaders to be alert for the men of the 99th. The Germans would not be far behind. The CP group began feverish attempts to finish covering their slit trenches. I thought how pitifully inadequate this little group would be should the Germans discover our exposed left flank and avoid the main force of the company in their attack. There was Savage, the phone to the platoons cupped to one ear, Blackburn, Charles and Robinson, the radio operators, Salberg, my runner, Boutare, Willie Hagan, Berger and Lampton, the platoon runners, Wright, the man we had retained in headquarters to repair radios, Olbin and Newbert, my 2 first sergeants, Lieutenant Flame and Lieutenant Middlebrook, Lieutenant Jackson and his 2 artillerymen, Lieutenant Donald Y. Solder of Brownwood, Texas, 81 mm mortar observer from Company M and his 1 assistant. Hardly a formidable obstacle should the enemy come the undefended route in force. I took stock of our defensive situation. We were 1 rifle battalion thrust into a densely wooded area with no terrain features that favoured the defender, with orders to hold at all costs. We were hastily dug in along a highway facing the direction from which we hoped the enemy would come, if he had to come. No company had been able to withhold a support platoon. There was no support company. Thus the defence was a thin single line of riflemen. A shallow draw lay to the front of my rifle platoons, with a higher ridge rising beyond it, over which the enemy would soon be coming. Another draw led up my left flank, protected by 2 light machine guns and a few riflemen in a position in which no man in his right mind would place machine guns, unless he had no other method of defending the probable enemy approach. Our right flank lacked 50 yards of tying in with K Company along a fire break which bisected the highway. We had no anti-tank defence except the 2 Sherman tanks and a bazooka with 3 rounds of ammunition. We were being supported by 99th Division Artillery, an outfit about which we knew nothing, except that this was their first action except for holding a quiet defensive sector for a month. But there was nothing that could be done now but wait. At 10:30, a jeep loaded with men clipped down the highway toward the rear at breakneck speed. That would be the vanguard of the retreating battalion from the 99th. The Germans would be here soon. The stage was set, even though we did not like the scenery nor the expected antagonist in the drama. Curtain going up. A ragged column of troops appeared over the wooded ridge to the front of the 2D and 3D platoons. There were not over 200 men, the remnants of 900 who had fought gallantly to our front since they were hit by the German attack the preceding day. Another group the size of a platoon withdrew along the highway, donating the few hand grenades and clips of ammunition which they possessed to my first platoon. 2 men stayed to fight with my company. 2 enlisted men, carrying a badly wounded lieutenant, stopped exhausted with my 3D platoon. They could carry him no farther. I called for a litter squad. The riflemen could not be sure if the next troops that appeared over the ridge were friendly or enemy. I alerted the artillerymen to call for fire in the event the approaching troops were Germans. Lieutenant Brock's call came a few minutes later, scarcely preceding a hail of small arms fire which sounded like the crack of thousands of rifles echoing through the forest. There was no doubt now. My men could see the billed caps of the approaching troops. They were Germans. I called for artillery fire from an overlay of concentrations which Lieutenant Jackson had plotted by map since he had been unable to zero the barrages because of the friendly elements to our front. 3 rounds whistled over the treetops and crashed in the draw to our front. Was that all of the concentration? Brock called for more. I relayed his request to the artillerymen, demanding a battery volley. 3 rounds whistled overhead in answer. I called again for a volley, but only 3 rounds came. Lieutenant Jackson said the artillery was short of ammunition. I felt a sinking feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Long was on the sound-powered phone. Had I given an order for the 2 tanks to withdraw? I had not. Well, they were withdrawing. They were moving up the highway toward the rear. I got Colonel Tuttle on the battalion radio. There had been no orders for the tankers to withdraw. He checked with the tank commanders and reported back that the tankers were merely moving to my 3D platoon area to improve their positions. I would have preferred their presence on the left flank, but I accepted the explanation. After all, they knew their job, and there was only the 1 tank approach. I was satisfied as long as they were in the company area. Enemy bullets whistled through the trees around us. I jumped into the slit trench with Savage and Blackburn. Request after request for artillery and mortar support came from the platoon leaders. I called for every concentration listed on my overlay and for variations of each. The inevitable maddening 3 rounds fell each time. The platoon leaders begged frantically for more. I began on one side of the company area and called for concentrations all across our front and back again. Lieutenant Sawyer called for barrage after barrage of 81 mm mortar fire. The crack of small arms fire reached an ear-splitting crescendo, like static on a forgotten radio during an electrical storm. The conversations over the battalion radio told me that the enemy was hitting K and L companies as well, but the main force of the attack seemed directed against us. The 3D platoon called again for artillery in the draw to their front. The enemy had withdrawn to the bottom of the draw and was regrouping for another assault. The small arms fire stopped. A tense silence settled over the forest, broken now and then by the crack of a single shot. Long suddenly called for artillery fire on a high ridge, which rose high above the other terrain features 1/4 of a mile to his front. He had spotted a mass of assembled enemy infantry and at least 10 enemy tanks. We fired 2 of the 3 round salvos. Long said there were no hits on the tanks, but they had dispersed. I quickly forgot about the tank threat in the excitement of the situation. Another hail of small arms fire told me the attackers had reorganized for a second assault. Frantic cries for artillery and mortar support came from the platoons. Lieutenant Wilson wanted 2 litter squads. He had 2 men badly wounded. Couldn't I get the litter to remove the lieutenant from the 99th? I lay flat on my back in the slit trench, the platoon phone to one ear, the receiver of the battalion radio to the other. The chill from the frozen earth seeped through my clothes, and I shivered, but I was surprised at my own calmness. The long nights of shaking terror in the pillboxes had convinced me that I could never be calm in combat. I did not know what had possessed me to keep me calm. Surely this was the most serious situation in which I had ever found myself. The small arms fire reached another crackling crescendo. Long had several men wounded. He didn't know how many or how badly. The enemy bullets were too thick to move around. I called again for litter squads. Wave after wave of fanatically screaming German infantry stormed the slight tree-covered rise held by the 3 platoons. A continuous hail of fire exuded from their weapons, answered by volley after volley from the defenders. Germans fell right and left. The few rounds of artillery we did succeed in bringing down caught the attackers in the draw to our front, and we could hear their screams of pain when the small arms fire would slacken. But still they came. Artillery and Nebelwerfers, with their accompanying terrifying screams, played a basso profundo in the background. The shells exploded to our rear and around the road junction to our right. We ignored their crushing explosions, thinking only how thankful we were that their effects were reserved for others than ourselves. The small arms fire rose and fell again and then again, indicating that the attacking troops had withdrawn momentarily to the bottom of the draw to regroup before launching another suicidal assault. Reinforcements streamed over the ridge behind them to join the assaults. The draw and the highway were littered with their dead and wounded, but there seemed to be no end to their fanatical attacks. I heard no more about the tanks that Long had spotted earlier. The knowledge of their presence was less foreboding, since I knew that the 2 Shermans were present to defend the lone tank approach. The open left flank continued to plague me, and I kept in constant touch with Long, asking if he could observe enemy troops moving around to the left. The woods prevented him from seeing, but he knew from the firing in the draw on the left that the light machine gunners were having a stiff fight. All 3 platoons and the 60 mm mortars began to beg for more ammunition. I sent 3 men from company headquarters to the firebreak opposite battalion to see if there was any ammunition left there. There was none. Repeated calls to battalion brought assurances from Captain Montgomery that they were doing all we can. Battalion had moved from the firebreak farther to the right rear. The 2D platoon reported a company soldier killed. It was the first death in Company 1 since I had taken command 3 months before, but the news was not so staggering as I had expected it would be. There was too much other excitement. The dead soldier was technician 5th grade Martin W. Carlson, the Pennsylvania aid man whom the rifleman idolized, who had jumped from his foxhole to aid a wounded soldier nearby. A bullet pierced his helmet, and he fell face forward in the hole of the wounded rifleman he had sought to aid. He was a non-combatant according to the rules of warfare, and was denied the privilege of wearing the combat infantryman badge and the $10 per month pittance for dangers and hardships endured. But death had made no distinction. Message after message came over the platoon phone. Lieutenant Wilson was badly wounded. He could not walk and must have a litter. Ammunition was running lower and lower. The M Company machine gunners with the 1st platoon were out of ammunition, except enough to keep one gun firing a few minutes longer. The 60 mm mortars found their ammunition supply so low that they fired only when the enemy was actually assaulting. Germans were being killed as close as 10 yards to forward foxholes. Hand grenades were practically all gone. There was no solace from battalion. Each call for litter bearers or additional ammunition was met with the maddening words, "We're doing all we can." I told them we could not hold out much longer unless we got additional ammunition. Captain Montgomery said we must hold. "Our orders are to hold at all costs," he said. I wondered if he could possibly realize the meaning of those words. We must hold until every last man was killed or captured. Company I's last stand. And what is to be gained? Nothing but time. Time born of the bodies of dead men. Time. 7 times the enemy infantry assaulted, and 7 times they were greeted by a hail of small arms fire and hand grenades that sent them reeling down the hill, leaving behind a growing pile of dead and wounded. But the attacks seemed poorly organized. There was no supporting artillery or mortar fire upon our positions, and I wondered why they had not yet found the open flank on our left. There was only the suicidal wave of fanatical infantrymen, whooping and yelling and brandishing their rifles like men possessed. I looked at my watch. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. Time was passing amazingly fast. Long said he saw the enemy tanks. There were 5 of them, giant tigers lumbering down the road 300 yards away, surrounded by over 100 enemy infantrymen. Get those Shermans into action. It's your only hope. You might hold off the infantry even with your ammunition practically exhausted, but riflemen can't fight tiger tanks. The first platoon has your only 3 rounds of bazooka ammo. Unless the Shermans can stop them, 3 rockets are all there is between you and Company Y and Kingdom Come. I called Sergeant Garcia to send a man to contact the tankers and tell them to move immediately to their former positions on the left flank. This business of improved positions was so much bosh. Garcia's answer was stunning. "They're gone, Captain. They pulled back to K Company 15 minutes ago." I did not take time for the full meaning of his words to sink in. I gave our call sign over the radio and asked for Colonel Tuttle and told him my plight. Either I got those tanks back to my left flank, or I could not possibly hold the positions. I waited for the Colonel's answer and tried barrage after barrage to destroy the big tigers with artillery and mortars, but we made not a single hit, and the near misses only stopped the infantry temporarily, not phasing the great steel monsters in the least. They waddled effortlessly on toward the hapless riflemen. A round of 88 mm fire snapped the top from a fir tree above our heads, and fragments sprayed in all directions. There could be no doubt now. The tigers had arrived. Round after round crashed into the area, a momentary shrill whistle followed by a deafening explosion, and the sharp thud of the round being fired, the latter reaching us after we heard the shell explode. "For God's sake, Captain!" Long screamed over the phone, his voice half sobbing. "Get those tanks down here! Do something for God's sake! These bastards are sitting 75 yards away and pumping 88S into our foxholes like we were sitting ducks! For God's sake, Captain!" "What about your bazooka?" He said a bullet had gone in one end and bent the tube so the rocket would not pass through it. Colonel Tuttle was on the battalion radio. The tankers said it would be suicide for them to face the Tiger tanks. They would not move unless he gave them a direct order, and then he was afraid they would disobey it. And he was inclined to agree that they stood no chance against the more heavily armoured Tigers and their 88S. I burned with anger, and I must have been insubordinate. If my men could fight the armour-plated monsters with nothing but rifles and die in the attempt, the tankers could afford to try it with medium tanks. "If we don't get the tanks, we can't hold another 5 minutes," I said slowly and finally. "Thank you, sir. Roger, out." Shades of General Custer. Company I's last stand. Hell, what does it matter? You never expected to get out of this war alive anyway. Not really. I gave Long the news. He was frantic. There was absolutely nothing he and his men could do. A direct hit had landed on one of the heavy machine guns. Another had hit in Technical Sergeant Smith's foxhole. Smith was the platoon sergeant. Long didn't know if he was dead or not. The other machine gun crew was out of ammunition and was withdrawing. He was powerless to stop them. He was afraid his left flank in the draw was falling back, but he couldn't see to make sure. "Hold, Long!" I cried. "For God's sake, hold! We've got to hold!" I wondered how I made my voice so convincing. I wanted to throw away the platoon phone and the battalion radio and everything connected with war, and bury my head in my hands and cry, cry, cry. The infantry assault upon the other platoons continued. The sound of the battle reached a height which I had never thought possible before. The burst of the 88mm shells in the woods vied with the sound of hundreds of lesser weapons. It couldn't last forever, I thought. It must stop sometime. It must stop. But when? And how? I looked toward the draw between me and the highway. About 20 men were walking down the draw toward the rear. I recognized several men from the light machine gun section and a machine gun crew from M Company. The others were riflemen from the 1st Platoon. I did not know where they were going. All I knew was that somehow I must stop them. I jumped from the slit trench and ran toward them, ignoring the crack of bullets through the trees, waving my arms and shouting for them to stop. They turned to look at me with vague, blank expressions. They seemed to wonder who this crazy man was who wanted them to do this foolish thing. I saw that it was the entire left flank of the 1st Platoon. The thin lines of the remainder of the platoons would soon be cut off from the rear. The 60mm mortarmen, a few yards away, were dismantling their weapons. I managed to get the men to move to my CP, but I could not stop them there. They walked slowly on toward the rear, half-dazed expressions on their faces. I jumped into the slit trench and grasped the radio handpiece. I sat on the edge of the trench, ignoring the whistle of bullets and the crash of 88mm shells around us, as everyone seemed now to be doing. "Get the platoon leaders on the phone," I called to Savage. "Hello, Roger 1, I said into the radio, not waiting for acknowledgement that they were receiving my message. "This is Mac. My left flank has fallen back. I can't stop them. The Germans are overrunning my left platoon. I'll try to build up another line along the fire break. We can't hold here." There, I had said it. This was I, Company turning tail and running. This was I, Company retreating. This was I, Company hauling ass. This was I, Company running like a son of a bitch. Strangely, I didn't give a damn. I was utterly void of feeling. Savage held the platoon phone toward me. "I can't get long," he said, "and Scotty's here with us now. Don't sound afraid. You've got to sound like you mean business." "Hello, Brock," I said calmly. "They've overrun Long's position. Swing your platoon back to the left rear and we'll build up another line along the fire break. Did you get that, Garcia? Pull back and we'll tie in with K Company. My CP's pulling out now. We've got to hold at the fire break. Do you understand that? We've got to hold at the fire break." The men in my CP group were already moving toward the rear. I grabbed my musette bag and my carbine. Savage took the phone. Blackburn grabbed the radio. We ran toward the rear. We reached the north-south fire break and crossed it. The foxholes which Battalion had occupied were along the far edge of the clearing in a patch of small interwoven firs, whose branches intertwined to form a dense green barrier. I knew that any fight here would be at close quarters, because the Germans would be able to advance unseen to the edge of the fire break 15 yards from the foxholes we would occupy, but it was the only spot where there would be any possibility of holding. I ran up and down the line, shouting, "We've got to hold 'em here! We've got to hold 'em here!" The men stared back at me unbelievingly. I was asking headquarters men armed with carbines and pistols to hold off hordes of attacking Germans that had already broken through all our rifle platoons could offer. There was only one machine gun, a light gun manned by Private First Class Richard Cowan of Wichita, Kansas, set up 5 feet from the foxhole which I occupied. The Germans were upon us almost before we knew what was happening. We could not see them for the low-hanging branches of the fir trees across the firebreak, but we could hear their shouts and shrill whistle signals, which evidently came from their leaders. I decided they were a flanking group that was on its way unseen around our left flank, even as we left our former CP. The attackers who had dislodged the first platoon could not have reached us so quickly. Cowan began to spit machine gun fire across the narrow firebreak, and I heard a German scream with pain. The headquarters men fired their carbines and pistols into the low-hanging branches. The fir trees to the right were too thick to see the area where the rifle platoons were supposed to be going into position. I wondered if they had been able to build up any semblance of a line. A round from an enemy tank broke the top from the small fir above Cowan's head, sending him reeling from his gun, but he jumped back and continued to fire. I knew that the big tigers had reached the junction of the firebreak with the highway. Hails of enemy bullets thrashed the snow and the fir trees around us. I ducked beneath the cover of my foxhole to try to get battalion on the radio, but without success. Then I stood up and looked out of the hole. Great God! There was no one left but Cowan. The others had fallen back. I jumped from the foxhole and yelled to Cowan to withdraw. Savage and Blackburn followed me. I left my musette bag lying on the ground, but my carbine was over my shoulder. Absent-mindedly, I screamed to get the radios. Savage jumped back into the foxhole, and Blackburn and I turned and plunged through the thickly interlaced branches of the little firs. Bullets followed us, lashing the firs on all sides of us, and I wondered if maybe I had been hit. I felt no pain, but I could not see how any human being could endure those hails of bullets and not be wounded. I stumbled blindly through the brush, unheedful of the branches scratching my hands and face. My overshoes were slick, and I tripped and fell face downward in the snow. I rose again and stumbled blindly on. As we plunged through the firs, I was separated from Blackburn and the group that had held briefly at the firebreak. I did not worry that Savage or the others were not with me. They were someplace else in the fir thicket. I came across Sergeant Albin and Sergeant Walter L. Dieterich of Cincinnati, Ohio, a machine gun squad leader. We ploughed through the firs together until we came unexpectedly upon K Company's CP, a series of half-completed foxholes dug in the frozen red earth. Captain Howard C. Wilson of Houston, Texas, the K Company commander, was talking frantically over his radio. He turned as I approached. "Damn, but I'm glad to see you," he said. "Battalion lost contact with you, and I haven't heard a thing about how your company's coming." He seemed more relieved than perturbed at seeing me, and I wondered what he thought brought me to his CP. Perhaps it was the way I stood looking at him blankly. There must have been nothing in my face to tell him that my company was no more, and that even now hordes of Germans were rushing toward us unchecked. Through my mind raced only one thought. I had failed, and failed miserably. My orders had been to hold at all costs, and I, personally, had failed. Because of my failure, the entire battalion would be routed or annihilated, and all from a local German counterattack. I Company had fallen back, but I could not blame the men. They had given in because, in some way, I had not led them correctly. It was I who was responsible. I would turn in my captain's bars if I ever reached the rear, or perhaps they would court-martial me. I did not care. "There's nobody on your left flank," I told Captain Wilson, in a matter-of-fact voice that I hardly recognized as my own. "They just knocked the hell out of us, and the whole company's fallen back. I couldn't tell you where any of I Company is right now except these two sergeants and myself." "Good God! What can I do, Mac?" "I don't know," I said. "You can't hold here. There's nothing on your left." Bullets whistled through the trees. Shells from the enemy tanks crushed gaping holes in the green growth of the firs. Men looked at each other with blank expressions on their faces. A lieutenant kneeling in a foxhole beside an artillery radio spoke to me. "You might as well get in away from the bullets, Captain." As if in a daze, I moved to his foxhole, and Albin and Dieterich sought cover. The lieutenant proffered his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Michelson," he said. I took his hand and mumbled my name. "Hell of a spot to meet," he replied, "but I'm glad to meet you. Maybe we'll get together under a little better circumstances someday." "Yeah," I said. "Maybe." The bullets whined around us, and the 88 mm shells exploded with crushing explosions that made me jump. Captain Wilson stood in his foxhole with his platoon phone glued to his ear. "My left platoon has fallen back," he cried. "It's those goddamn tanks." "Yeah," I said. "I had 3 rounds of bazooka ammo, and they knocked the bazooka out." "I've got 6 rounds," Captain Wilson said. 2 men grabbed a bazooka and disappeared into the underbrush in the direction of the enemy. I thought how foolish it was to think of stopping 10 Tiger tanks with 1 bazooka. The 2 soldiers returned a moment later, panting for breath. "Good God, Captain," one of them said. "The woods just a few yards from here are full of the bastards. We'd better get the hell out." "That settles it. Tell the other 2 platoons to withdraw into Crinkelt and Rocherath. Notify battalion. Tell them we're getting the hell out. We plunged again through the thick fir trees toward the rear. I heard battalion on Captain Wilson's radio telling L Company to withdraw into Rocherath before the full force of the enemy's flanking drive should hit them. We reached the edge of the patch of small firs. To our left lay the exposed highway leading up the hill into Rocherath. To our right, the corner of the fir thicket joined the corner of a patch of larger trees which extended 200 yards up the hill. We chose the latter route without hesitation. We ran halfway through the patch of woods before we came to a group of abandoned foxholes. Captain Wilson yelled to the group to halt. "We'll hold up here," he shouted. "We may be able to hold them up while some of the others get out." I could not see what good we could do from this position, but I was taking the commands now, and I took cover alone in a foxhole on the edge of the woods facing the highway. It was good to let someone else do the thinking for a while, even if I disagreed with the decision. I was not afraid. Instead, I was strangely apathetic to the whole affair. The Germans were hot on our tails. So what? They had been hot on my tail for almost as long as I could remember now, and they had cut my company to ribbons. They might as well get me too. German infantrymen emerged from the fir thicket we had left such a short time before, and milled around 2 abandoned US light tanks parked in the open beside the forest. A Company M machine gunner, Private First Class Jose M. Lopez of Brownsville, Texas, set up his gun beside a hole 5 feet to my rear. He opened up on the German infantry, the blast of the muzzle forcing me to sink to the bottom of my hole for cover. The Germans wasted no time in returning the fire, riddling the area around the machine gun and my foxhole with burp gun and rifle fire. A Tiger tank appeared at the road junction where the battalion had been shelled the night before and fired point-blank at Lopez's exposed position. The long barrel of the 88 on the tank seemed to reach half the distance from the hull to my foxhole. Lopez continued to fire. An American jeep with 2 aid men, their red Geneva crosses painted on their helmets, tore down the highway from the direction of Rocherath toward the road junction. I held my breath. The Tiger tank would surely blast them from the road. Couldn't they see that the Germans were here now? They did. With the jeep spinning on 2 wheels, they turned around and tore back up the road. The tank did not fire. Over the noise of Lopez's machine gun firing, I could hear Captain Wilson shouting to withdraw into Rocherath. I wanted to obey, but I was caught in the crossfire of the heavy machine gun and the attackers. I gritted my teeth and waited for a lull in the firing. None came. I jumped from the hole and ran blindly toward the rear. Bullets snipped at my heels. The tank saw that we were running again and opened with renewed vigour, the big shells snapping the tops from the trees around us as if they were matchsticks. But I saw no one fall. Dusk was approaching, and it was difficult to see for any great distance. I could not make out the town of Rocherath that I knew was high on the hill to our left front, but we plunged blindly up the hill, following a thin hedgerow that would be scant protection should the Germans elect to follow us with fire. I slipped and fell face down in the snow. I cursed my slick overshoes. I rose and fell again. I found myself not caring if the Germans did fire. Snow had gotten inside my shoes, and my feet were soaked. My clothes were drenched. Perspiration covered my body, and my mouth was dry. I wanted a cigarette. I felt like we were helpless little bugs scurrying blindly about now that some man-monster had lifted the log under which we had been hiding. I wondered if it would not be better to be killed, and perhaps that would be an end to everything. High on the hill to my left, I could see L Company withdrawing. Enemy artillery pounded in the middle of the ragged retreating column, the fiery glow of the explosions shining brilliantly in the gathering darkness. Isn't artillery fire pretty at night? Other barrages exploded over a wide expanse of snow-covered ground to the front. I wondered why there was no answer from our own artillery. We came upon a group of dirty infantrymen digging in along a hedgerow. "What outfit?" I asked. "9th Infantry," a GI answered, his face covered with beard and dirt. "It ain't enough we attack for 5 Fiji days. We gotta turn around and take up somebody else's defence." "It's that goddamn 23D," another said. They let a Kraut patrol knock the hell out 'em. Captain Wilson and the other men were gone. Only Albin, Dieterich, and I were left. I saw a major and 2 captains on reconnaissance. They asked my outfit. "I saw your battalion commander a few minutes ago," the major said, and directed me to a farmhouse beside the highway. We changed directions and made for the farmhouse. Infantrymen were digging into the front of the house. I stepped inside a stone barn on the right. Captain Montgomery was there. "Hello, Mac," he said simply, shaking my hand. The thought that I had been a miserable failure came back with a force that brought tears to my eyes, and words would not come from my throat. Monty tried to comfort me. The colonel was in the basement of the house. I would feel better after I talked with him. We walked across the courtyard and down the dark steps of the house into the basement. A group of enlisted men was eating K-rations. Colonel Tuttle was talking quietly with a group of officers. A dim candle lit the room. "Nice work, Mac," Colonel Tuttle said. I could control myself no longer. The choking sensation in my throat became racking sobs that I could not hold back. The colonel tried to comfort me, and I felt foolish and childish, but I could not stop. Someone gave me a cigarette. I held it with trembling fingers. I was suddenly conscious that Colonel Tuttle was saying something to me, but at first I could not make any sense of what he was saying. This had been no local German attack. The enemy had already broken through and taken Bullingen, catching the division quartermaster and engineer troops unaware in the undefended town. The main supply route from Krinkelt to the rear through Bullingen had thus been severed. The other 2 battalions of our regiment had been thrown into the battle, and the division was abandoning all its gains in the Wallerscheid offensive to hold this critical area. Our battalion had held long enough for the 9th and 38th Regiments to withdraw past the vital crossroads guarded by 2 stone farmhouses that I remembered from the trip forward. The 9th was setting up a line along our present location, and the 38th had taken over the defence of Krinkelt. There were unconfirmed rumours that this was a big German push all along the First Army front. The news stunned me. I stammered, I mean you did a good job, Mac," the colonel said. "The Germans are throwing everything they've got. You held out much longer than I expected after I learned the true situation. So I had not failed, and our company had not failed. I was almost happy that the German offensive was on a large scale. My men had done an excellent job against heavy odds, and those who had died were not dead because of some personal failing of mine. The realization made me want to cry again. "They got our kitchens too, Mac," the colonel continued. "They were evacuating Krinkelt when they ran smack into a column of German tanks. Got all 5 of them. Bullingen had already been taken." I thought of my typewriter and the article I had written, 9 days in a pillbox, that were stored on our kitchen truck, and then dismissed the thought as being ridiculous when there were probably lives lost on that same kitchen truck. I went with Captain Montgomery back to the barn outside. It was dark now. War was all around me still, but I felt much better. There would be courage to go on. I still did not know what had happened to my company, but I could believe now that they might have made their way out of the forest along the route taken by Company L. Sparky. Lieutenant Middlebrook, Wright, and Butara were in the barn. The 2 men and 2 officers, and Albin, Dieterich, and myself made a total of 7 men from Company 1. They seemed as glad to see me as I was to see them. "We heard you were killed, Captain," Sparky said. The idea seemed remote and far away, and I laughed falsely. "We know a lot of your men ended up in Krinkelt and Rocherath," Captain Montgomery said. "The colonel and I are going there now to contact L Company. They got out pretty light, except for an artillery barrage after they left the woods. We'll send them and any of your men we find to meet you here. You dig in with L Company to defend the right flank of the 9th. There's no one between them and Rocherath." We found a pile of fresh hay in the end of the barn facing the enemy. I dug out an armful and spread it in a rear corner of the barn. I was cold. My clothes were soaked and my feet were drenched, but I pulled a portion of the hay over me and drifted off into a sleep of utter exhaustion. It was neither the sound of the tanks firing, nor the artillery exploding, nor the staccato chant of automatic weapons that woke me. I seemed to hear them somewhere in the background, but my fatigued body did not respond. Someone was shaking me. "Wake up, Captain! Wake up! The son of a bitches have hit us again. They're all over the goddamned place." I jumped to my feet. The sound of battle in my ears was real now, and I could see the flash of tracer bullets as they passed the open door. "Where's L Company?" I asked. "They didn't get here," the soldier answered, and I could not make out who he was in the darkness. "The others are gone. We'd better get the hell out." With that, he was gone from the barn. I did not think to pick up my carbine. I looked toward the forward end of the barn where the hay had been stored. A tank was firing point blank into the barn. The dry hay was a mass of flame. I ran from the barn. The surrounding area was lit up from the flames and the paths of thousands of fiery tracer bullets. I saw a soldier, silhouetted against the tracers, throw a can of gasoline at a tank. The tank burst into flame. There seemed to be no lull coming in the firing. I ran toward the rear of the farmhouse, snagging my trousers on a fence post and tearing at them madly. I flattened myself against the back wall of the stone building just as a shell from an enemy tank crashed into the front. It rocked precariously, trembling from the impact of the explosion. The snow-covered area to the rear of the house became the beaten zone for countless tracer bullets. Tank fire crashed around the building. Artillery fell without pattern in the snow. The night was ablaze with more noise and flame than I had thought possible for men to create. Here was a movie war. Here was Armageddon. I could see the outlines of a bomb crater halfway between the house and the first hedgerow behind it. I waited for a lull in the firing before leaving the momentary safety of the back of the house. I ran as fast as I could across the open field and dove headfirst into the bomb crater. My body hit two other men huddling in the hole. They were Wright and Butara. "Where are the others?" I asked, once my first surprise at seeing them had passed. "They all got out, I think," Butara said. "I saw them all but Albin and Dieterich. They were sleeping in the front of the barn." "Well, we can't stay here," I said, thinking of the completely open flank. "We'll find battalion headquarters and stick with them." We climbed from the crater and ran across the remaining portion of the open field. A hedgerow loomed ahead of me, and I dove headfirst across it. My head burrowed into a deep snowdrift, and I lay there for a moment panting from the exertion. I found Wright and Butari again, and we followed the course of the hedgerow on hands and knees toward the north. I knew that we should reach the highway again after it passed the farmhouse and curved left to lead to the crossroads, and then into Rocherath. We crawled on, paying no attention to the wet snow which chafed our hands and knees. A burst of tank fire on the hedgerow before us brought us to a stop. We lay flat against the snow. A voice came from the other side of the hedge. "Who's there?" "Some men from Company 1, 23D, I said. "That you, Captain?" It was Middlebrook. He crawled through the hedgerow to join us. "I left the barn with Sparky," he said, "but we got separated." The four of us moved on behind the hedgerow until we reached an area where the firing was less intense. I looked back. The barn beside the farmhouse was enveloped in flame. Two objects to the front were burning. They must be German tanks. Beyond the barn, near the woods, the radar set of an anti-aircraft battery still smouldered. It must have been destroyed by its crew when our battalion had been knocked from position, I thought. We reached a road running east-west, but it was covered with snow, and I could not tell in the darkness if it was the highway. A company of soldiers was digging in on the north side of the road. They didn't know where they were, but they were from the 9th Infantry. They had been told to dig in here. Maybe I could find their lieutenant. He might know their location. I found a lieutenant. He said he didn't know how to get to Rocherath, but his battalion CP was at a crossroads to the northwest. If I'd take the road on our right, we couldn't miss it. There were two farmhouses at the crossroads. Troops were moving up the road, one shivering, unevenly spaced column on either side. A misty rain set in to add to the cold. The troops would sink slowly and silently to the ground as an artillery shell or a round from a tank whistled dangerously close to the road. The centre of the battle continued to emanate from the vicinity of the barn and farmhouse we had just left, the fiery glow of the burning barn diminishing rapidly now. Our own artillery was firing, and I could tell from the lusty, unsparing number of rounds that 2 D Division artillery had gone into action. 2 gaunt grey buildings loomed against the dark sky at the crossroads. A major cursed beneath his breath as he tried to turn a column of trucks around in the muddy road. I asked if he knew where I might find headquarters of the 3D Battalion, 23D Infantry. He directed me to the nearer farmhouse. I found Colonel Tuttle in the cellar. He was waiting there for orders with the few remaining men of his battalion headquarters. He had been unable to get through to Krinkelt and Rocherath when he left me at dusk. Enemy tanks and infantry had infiltrated into both towns, and fierce fights were raging back and forth. Major Joseph, Captain Montgomery, and 15 enlisted men were with him. They had heard from Lieutenant Robert M. Green of Beverly Hills Cal D, the battalion intelligence officer. He had collected a sizable force from the battalion, including a number of my men, and was fighting along with elements of the 38th Infantry in Krinkelt. The Colonel and Major Joseph had 1 supper K ration between them. They prepared to eat it, and I realized for the first time how hungry I was. It was midnight, and I had not eaten since breakfast, and then it had been only a K ration. I refused politely, but they insisted, and I had a bite of the hash. I had never consumed a more delectable morsel. Colonel Tuttle told me to spend the night with them. In the morning, he would send me out to try to round up more men from the battalion. The cellar was damp, and my soggy clothing made me shiver violently, but I sat down on a mattress in a corner and tried to sleep. I slept for a few minutes, woke up shaking, walked around the room several times, and sat down again. The noise of the battle filtered through the cellar walls for the remainder of the night, and did not lessen in intensity with the coming of dawn. Captain Montgomery came back from the CP of a unit of the 9th Infantry across the road, with the news that the enemy had struck anew at K Company of the 9th, the company defending the farmhouse where we had waited to go in with Company L. The company commander, First Lieutenant Stephen E. Trupner of Baltimore, Mumdy, had called for artillery fire on his own position around the farmhouse when the enemy overran the area. Only 12 men from the company escaped. I set out at 7 o'clock with Middlebrook, Wright and Butara in an effort to locate other men from the battalion. We had gone only 600 yards when I realized that it was impossible to traverse the route which the colonel had pointed out on his map. The area was an inferno of small arms and artillery fire, as the Germans continued their efforts to dislodge the dogged doughboys who prevented them from reaching the vital crossroads. We returned to the farmhouse. The day passed slowly. The din of the battle did not slacken. Someone discovered a case of K rations on the 2nd floor of the farmhouse, and we each ate several with childlike enthusiasm. Captain Montgomery brought in various reports from the CP across the road. 13 enemy tanks had infiltrated an American column during the night, hiding in barns in Krinkelt and giving the defenders of the town several hours of veritable hell with the coming of morning. 7 had been knocked out with bazookas and tank destroyers. The 1st Battalion of the 9th, the unit defending the vital crossroads, was holding successfully, but their casualties had been tremendously heavy. There were numerous gaps in the line, and the entire left flank of the division, which included the road to Wallerscheid to our left, over which the 9th and 38th regiments had withdrawn from the attack against the Roer River dams, was completely undefended. A platoon of anti-tank guns had been placed around the 2 farmhouses, and a platoon of tank destroyers operated from the crossroads, answering calls from various units in distress. I tried not to think of the men from I Company, but I could not help myself. My thoughts ran continuously to Sergeant Savage and the others, and I wondered how many had survived the fierce fight in the forest and the fierce fighting which followed. Several of the men at the battalion CP had seen 1 or 2 of my men since the fight in the woods, but there was no news of Savage. I tried to think where I had seen him last, and the revelation that the last time had been when we pulled away from the firebreak frightened me. An emergency call from the 1st Battalion of the 9th for men to fill a gap in their line caused Colonel Tuttle to round up all available riflemen, including Wright and Butara, and place them under the command of Lieutenant Middlebrook. I told them goodbye at the door upstairs, thinking how miserable they must feel at the prospect of going out into that blazing no-man's land to meet the Germans again. I thanked heaven that I was an officer whom the colonel considered he must save to command Company 1 again when we should get back together, but I felt little and selfish with the feeling. Middlebrook returned at 3 o'clock. They had been engaged in a fight even before they reached the area designated for them to defend. He had come back for more men. They could not hold the spot alone. Colonel Tuttle said there were no more men. A burst of machine-gun fire zinged over the crossroads. From the cellar, the fire sounded as if it came from an extremely long range. No one seemed perturbed until a soldier came running down from upstairs. "We'd better get the hell out, Colonel," he shouted. "Those bastards are closing in from the left, not more than 200 yards away." The colonel's coolness communicated itself to me, but I could not rid myself of the feeling of dejection that came with the realization that now I must run from Germans and death again. It seemed to me that I had been running from Germans for as long as I could remember. Was there no stopping place? The colonel told everyone to get his equipment ready. He went upstairs and returned a moment later to announce that we were leaving. Enemy troops were approaching along the undefended Wallerscheid road. I left my slick overshoes in the cellar. Maybe some German would get them, and then he could fall face down in the snow. We dashed across the crossroads toward the southwest, machine-gun bullets whining over our heads. Our objective was the town of Würzfeld. It was next to impossible to get into Krinkelt and Rocherath. I could see the tank destroyers backing from the sheds around the farmhouses to meet the new threat. Würzfeld was a little farming town surrounded by hills. We went to the house used as a command post by the 2D Battalion of our regiment. Their troops were dug in on the hill to the southeast of the town, facing Bullingen, but they held the commanding ground and had been able to organize it before the enemy hit them. Middlebrook came in. He had tried to reach the men whom he had left in position when the CP pulled out, but he was unable to make it. A fierce fight was going on now at the crossroads. The 1st Battalion of the 9th had sent remnants of a rifle company to help the TDs stop the threat in order to hold open their escape route until dark. I learned at the 2D Battalion CP that a number of my men were fighting with 2D Battalion companies, and others had assembled at the Battalion CP. Among them was Scotty, who told me that almost all his weapons platoon had made their way back to Elsenborn and were now driving ammunition vehicles back and forth to the front. All the men who had been with me in the brief defence of the firebreak were safe, he said, to the best of his knowledge, except those who had gone with me, Sergeant Savage, and Private First Class Lampton, the weapons platoon runner. One of the men had seen Lampton get hit and fall as they pulled back from the firebreak. He had thought Savage was with me. We billeted for the night with the headquarters group of the 2D Battalion. I slept on the second floor of a thatched roof house, taking off my wet clothes and drying them by a roaring fire in the kitchen downstairs. I lay awake for what seemed like hours thinking of the men of the company who still had not been heard from, including Savage. I was too exhausted to stay awake long, and I drifted off into a sleep that was interrupted many times during the night by heavy shelling. I was on the forward side of the house, and on the second floor, with the scant protection one could expect from a straw roof, but I was so tired that I made no effort to go downstairs when the shellings began. The next morning, Colonel Tuttle called for a volunteer from among the lieutenants to take the remaining men to strengthen the line between the 1st and 2D battalions. Scotty and Middlebrook both insisted on going, but the colonel finally designated Scotty. It was 11 o'clock when Colonel Tuttle told me to assemble the remaining men, mostly specialists. He had talked with regiment by radio, and we were to move to the vicinity of Elsenborn, where approximately 200 men from the battalion had been assembled and were digging in a second line of defence for protection should the enemy make another penetration. Cooks and clerks from rear headquarters units had already assisted these men in digging positions a mile to the rear of Würzfeld, where the division would withdraw its defences as soon as the situation was stabilised sufficiently to effect a withdrawal. We assembled at a barn across the street from the 2D Battalion CP. Major Joseph told me there would be a 3/4-ton truck arriving in a few minutes to take us to the rear. I also might be interested in seeing the driver, he said. I wondered why he was talking in riddles. I saw the truck come around a bend in the muddy street. There were bullet holes in the shattered, dirty windshield, and I could not see the driver until he pulled up alongside. Then there was no mistaking the slow grin, the drawling, surprised, "Hello, Captain." No one else ever pronounced the 2 syllables of the word captain quite like that. Savage and I ran for each other like 2 college girls suddenly reunited. Smiles wreathed our faces. We both tried to talk at once. He had heard that I had been killed. I had not known what had become of him. "I jumped back into the foxhole after you said get the radios," he explained at length. "First thing I knew, there were Germans all over the place. They made me come out and took my watch and moved me over to the highway where they had 2 other GIs. Then one of our artillery barrages started falling. The Krauts hit the dirt. I grabbed one of their burp guns and started spraying, and we ran like hell. All 3 of us got away." Since his escape, he had been hauling ammunition with a truck he had found abandoned in Krinkelt. He had a few close calls, as the bullet holes in the windshield testified, but he had come through without a scratch. He had brought a load of ammunition to the crossroads where I had been around noon the day before and had seen Major Joseph, but the Major had not mentioned that I was there. When no one was looking, he lifted a shelter half in the front seat to show me his proudest possession. He had found it in Krinkelt. "That's why I wouldn't ever give up this truck, even when the going got pretty hot," he said. There was a half case of gin and a half case of scotch. We moved on to the rear and set up for the night in Elsenborn. My shattered nerves were coming under control, but the enemy shelled the town fiercely during the night, and I discovered that we were as close to the actual fighting in Elsenborn as we had been in Würzfeld. The Würzfeld-Krinkelt-Rocherath positions stuck out into enemy territory in a salient. Colonel Tuttle had visited regimental headquarters, and I learned details of the big picture from him. The 9th and 38th Regiments, with scattered elements of the 99th Division, were defending Krinkelt and Rocherath. The remaining 2 battalions of the 23D were defending the supply route into Krinkelt and the town of Würzfeld. The 1st Infantry Division had been moved into line and now defended Butgenbach, thus halting the thrust from Bullingen on the most direct route to Elsenborn. The action was the north flank of a major German effort. Several divisions to our south, including our old positions near Heckhusheid, had been completely overrun, and Nazi spearheads were gaining daily. The elements of the 2D Division remaining in Krinkelt, Rocherath and Würzfeld withdrew during the night, according to division plan. The 38th Infantry occupied the front-line positions overlooking Würzfeld. The 2D Battalion of the 23D held a secondary defensive line along a ridge which included the town of Berg, between Elsenborn and Würzfeld. We would occupy secondary positions on the left. The next morning I joined the Provisional Company, made up of men who had thus far rejoined the battalion 400 yards to the northwest of Elsenborn, where they were digging in a secondary line. I was overjoyed to find 35 of my men, including Lieutenant Brock, Lieutenant Goffigan, and Sparky. We traded information back and forth on survivors of the action of the first day of the German offensive. Almost all of the men had heard rumours that I had been either killed or captured. Enemy artillery shelled us all day, but there were no casualties. A ragged column of GIs rapidly descended a high ridge to our left front around noon. We thought they were running from a German attack, and it was difficult to keep our men from moving to the rear. Everyone was nervous. A call to battalion verified that the retreating troops were from a unit that had just been relieved by another. It was only then that the nervous men were content to continue preparing the secondary positions. I had not trembled so violently at the sound of enemy artillery since leaving the pillbox positions in my first action, and now we all shuddered even at the sound of our own artillery pieces belching out their answering rounds.